We rely on computers sending personal and sensitive information every day, whether that be a credit card number, birth date, or that important message you sent to your friend. However, we take for granted the math and engineering required to keep that sensitive information secure. Like many technical topics, it may be daunting if we jump directly into the state-of-the-art implementations. However, I personally find, with most technical implementations, if you look at the beginning stages of development, the topic becomes much more digestible. And it helps you on the road to becoming an expert in the modern implementations as well. In this video, I want to discuss a technique developed by Ralph Merkle that revolutionized how computers can tell secrets and began the chain of thought to how computers tell secrets today. The technique was also one of those goosebump-inducing moments for me, as it connected the dots to motivating modern techniques while also having an underlying simplicity. Before discussing the details of the technique, I think it is important to first consider the ways people tell secrets. So I would like you to pause the video and think about how you would tell someone a secret and why someone trying to listen, or eavesdrop, would not have access to the information. Okay, so I'm guessing that the methods of telling a secret to another person mostly resemble the following. However, I know you are creative, so make sure to comment down below with alternative techniques you thought of to share a secret. So first, perhaps you thought of looking around and visually verifying that no one is around before saying the secret information. Or second, maybe you thought that you could simply whisper or speak quietly to avoid others nearby from hearing the secret information. Or lastly, maybe you could have created some kind of coded language with someone you know, so that the eavesdropper is unaware of what you were saying. While the three discussed options of a human sharing a secret are reasonable for humans, computers cannot effectively use the same methodologies. To demonstrate, imagine two computers connected by a single wire, or a wireless network for the sake of not seeming too outdated. These two computers are the desired parties, which we will refer to as Alice and Bob. If Alice and Bob wanted to send a secret message using options 1 or 2, they would have to prove that no other computer, or eavesdropper, is connected and trying to listen to their conversation. But how would computers go about verifying this? They do not have the option to look around and see the other computers. The main operation each computer can do is send information back and forth. But someone listening and not altering information does not affect those messages. It would then really be quite the challenge to verify no one is nearby. Since it is difficult to guarantee that no one is listening, we assume that eavesdroppers exist on the network. As such, let's add an eavesdropper named Eve to the model that listens to any information sent between Alice and Bob. It is important to note that in this model, Eve is not altering any of the information sent, but merely listening to the conversation. Now that we assume an eavesdropper is present, options 1 and 2 will not work, since the information being sent is unaltered, which is referred to as plain text or in the clear, and Eve is able to see the messages. Our last option had the two parties come up with a coded language before communication started. As an example, maybe the coded language simply shifts each letter by 1 in the alphabet, an example of a Caesar cipher. While a Caesar cipher is not a secure transformation, it demonstrates that Alice and Bob needed to have some shared information, in this case the shift amount of 1 letter forward in the alphabet, that is unknown to Eve. If the technique being used to transform or encrypt the information is secure, then Eve would not have access to the secrets being sent. This is a step in the right direction, but we now have a similar issue to what we faced before, in that we must ensure Alice and Bob can create the shared secret information, which we'll refer to as a key, without Eve seeing. Assuming that Eve is always listening on the main communication channel, an additional channel that is guaranteed not to have eavesdroppers would be required just for the key. In the paper titled Secure Communications over Insecure Channels, published by Ralph Merkle in 1975 and linked below, he says this of the key communication channel. Perhaps the only safe method is to send a trusted courier, with an attaché case chained to his wrist. This requires that you trust the courier. At this point, hopefully it is clear how hard the notion of trust is, and that if we want to share a secret while being completely observed by the eavesdropper Eve, we are going to need a different technique. So how did Ralph Merkle formulate a solution to the seemingly very difficult problem of establishing a key to encrypt information without Eve knowing the key? Surprisingly, the first step is for Alice to create end messages that contain a randomly generated message ID and a key from a very large space of possibilities, such as 2 to the 128th. For example, if we set n equal to 4, then the 4 messages may look something like the following, where the ID and key are chosen from a random sample of numbers between 0 and 100 for this illustrative example, rather than the large space of 2 to the 128th possibilities. Of course, we cannot simply send these messages without encrypting them first, which should transform the messages into gibberish. This process would be similar to the Caesar cipher used earlier, but unlike the Caesar cipher, there must not be any known attacks that are more efficient than simply trying each key until the correct key is found. The process of attacking the encryption function by trying the keys is known as a brute force attack. Today, something like the Advanced Encryption Standard could be used for the encryption of each message, which could have an entire video series dedicated to it itself, but simply serves to illustrate one such example of a function to use. So now, under the assumption that we have an encryption function that takes in the message and a key value, and outputs the encrypted message, typically called a ciphertext, we can apply it to each one of the messages and create what is referred to as a puzzle. By adjusting the number of possible keys that can be used to encrypt the message, the number of keys that must be attempted to solve the puzzle via brute force changes as well. We will define the number of possible keys in relation to the number of binary digits, or bits representing zeros and ones making up the key, with the variable k equaling the number of bits. Since each bit can take 2 possible values, a k-bit key represents 2 to the k possible key values, meaning we can adjust the value of k to get easier or harder puzzles to solve. For example, let's assume we have a computer that could try 1e to the 9th keys every second. If we have a k value of 36, those 2 to the 36 possible key values could be iterated on in a little over a minute. What is neat is that just changing the key bits to 40 from 36 changes the expected time to brute force from approximately 1 minute to approximately 19 minutes, demonstrating the ability to scale the difficulty of the problem as the key size is changed. And if that exponential increase in difficulty is not felt enough, changing the key size to 64 bits changes the time to solve a single puzzle to 584.9 years. Once we have decided on a k value and have encrypted or scrambled all of the messages, Alice can send all of the puzzles over the communication medium to Bob. Since Eve is always listening, Eve would also be able to see all of the puzzles as well. What Bob does now is pick a puzzle at random, and brute force attacks the puzzle to discover the plaintext. For our toy example, k is set to 6, and we will assume Bob chose puzzle 1 at random. So Bob would try each key until the expected message structure is correct, revealing this is message 18, the key equals 13. Now Bob knows that the key he can use with Alice to communicate is 13. So he can take whatever message he wants to send, encrypt it with the key 13, and send it to Alice. One note is that when sending and receiving messages, we are using a much larger key size, or k, of 128 bits, versus the less secure k value we use to encrypt each puzzle. We wanted Bob to be able to solve the puzzle, but we do not want anyone to be able to brute force the actual contents of the message being sent between Alice and Bob. In addition to sending the message, Bob sends the message ID, 18 for the chosen example, to Alice without encrypting it, so it is known to all parties. Alice is then able to look up the key for that given message ID, since she created the random ID and key mappings for each message. Now Bob and Alice each know the key, 13 for our small example, to communicate with. This is great, but we have to verify that Eve does not know the key, so let's look at the communication from Eve's perspective. As mentioned previously, when Alice sends all of the encrypted puzzles to Bob, Eve can also see the puzzles. However, Eve has no knowledge of the puzzle that was chosen by Bob, so the next information Eve sees is the encrypted message from Bob and the message ID, 18 in this case. While Eve knows the message ID, this reveals nothing about the key used for communication between Alice and Bob. To find the key, Eve would have to brute force each message, and then check if the message ID matched the message ID that she saw when Bob sent the message to Alice. So that means each puzzle requires a maximum of 2 to the k iterations to find the key, and Eve will have to brute force attack a maximum of n puzzles to find the correct key. So in total, we would expect n times 2 to the k iterations for Eve to break the key. From the perspective of Bob and Alice, Bob required a maximum of 2 to the k iterations to find the key, and Alice required n iterations to generate the puzzles. So we see something of interest here. The trusted parties had to do less work to establish the key, on the order of 2 to the k plus n, versus Eve doing on the order of n times 2 to the k. For our example puzzle, with only n equals 4 and k equals 6, the difference for the max complexity case is 188 iterations, or 3.76 times higher amount of effort for the eavesdropper versus Alice and Bob to establish the key. Going back to our system that completes 1 e to the 9th key checks in 1 second, the 0.25 microseconds to crack the key in this small example is definitely not secure. However, we can change the number of puzzles and the difficulty to solve each puzzle. To make the analysis a bit simpler, let us assume that the number of messages and the number of keys are equal, meaning that n is equal to 2 to the k. In this case, we can see that the adversary will require n squared iterations to determine the key being used by Alice and Bob, whereas Alice and Bob required 2 to the n iterations to set up the key, thus providing a quadratic relationship where Eve's complexity is approximately the complexity of Alice and Bob squared. As we increase n, then we see something really neat start to happen. The gap between the amount of effort Bob and Alice requires to set up communication and the amount of effort Eve must spend to determine the key grows larger. This is an amazing result because Alice and Bob can now generate a secret key with an eavesdropper on the channel listening to everything being sent. This gap created the revolution in public key cryptography that is constantly being used behind the scenes on the internet to secure your sensitive information. What I find so amazing about the development is that the concept and paper behind the discovery are very reasonable and more easily understood than modern algorithms for public key cryptography, but provide the essence of what all those further techniques are trying to accomplish. Which, paraphrasing Ralph Merkle, is if the work required of Eve to determine the key is much higher than the work put in by either Alice or Bob to select the key, then we have a solution. While this was an amazing discovery by Ralph Merkle, the main reason we needed new algorithms is that in order to create sufficient security, we would like to push the security against the eavesdropper to roughly 2 to the 128th iterations, which would require an n value of 2 to the 64. However, this means the complexity of generating the key for Alice and Bob is 2 times 2 to the 64, which is far more reasonable to compute than 2 to the 128. But we saw for a modest machine that completes 1 e to the 9th iterations per second that to determine a key would require over 580 years to generate. No one wants to wait that long for a secure connection. So we needed similar ideas, but that require less effort by Alice and Bob to establish the secret key. Modern techniques such as the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, or RSA, did just that. Just like Merkle's puzzles, they mathematically demonstrated that the work for Eve is much larger than Alice and Bob, but they did so while keeping the amount of work required by Alice and Bob to an efficient amount. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or have topics you are interested in learning more about, make sure to leave a comment down below, and I'll respond with a series of puzzles for you to solve to receive the answer.